Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I'm a deep web hitman, and my next victim is my great-grandpa, but he is already dead. Let me start by saying that I never intended to end up here. Nobody does. Life has a way of veering off course until you find yourself in places you never thought you'd be. That's how I ended up a hitman on the deep web. Yeah, you heard me right. I wasn't some trained assassin or anything. I was just a guy with a knack for computers and a desperate need for money. You'd be surprised how easy it is to stumble upon the darkest corners of the internet. I was a college dropout, stuck in a dead-end job with debts piling up. I started poking around the web, looking for ways to make quick cash. At first, it was just little things, hacking services, finding personal info for shady people. But then, the requests started getting darker, the payouts bigger. Before I knew it, I was in too deep to get out. It's been years now, and I've done things I can't even talk about. Every job comes with its own horrors, but they all pale in comparison to my latest assignment. This one has left me feeling like I'm trapped in some kind of sick joke. It started like any other job. I got an anonymous email with the target's details, the usual stuff: name, age, last known address, habits, and routines. But as I scanned through the file, something caught my eye. The name, Albert G. Marlowe. My heart skipped a beat. That was my great-grandpa's name. I thought it was just a coincidence at first. After all, Albert Marlowe isn't exactly a unique name. But as I read on, my stomach twisted into knots. The file included a photo of an old man sitting in a wheelchair, his eyes vacant and cloudy with age. It was unmistakably my great-grandpa. He died when I was a kid, around 10 or 11 years old. I remember the funeral, the smell of incense, and the way my mum cried quietly into her handkerchief. I remember standing in front of the open casket, staring at his face, wondering why he looked so different, like he wasn't really him anymore. He was gone, dead and buried. So why was he suddenly my next target? I started digging, trying to find any clues that might explain this twisted mess. I scoured family records and called my mom under the guise of wanting to know more about our family history. It all confirmed what I already knew. My great-grandpa had died years ago. There was no mistake there. I kept going back to the photo in the file. His eyes were wrong, but not just because they were lifeless with age. There was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was like he was looking through the camera, straight at me. I shuddered every time I saw it. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or a flaw in the photo, but it haunted me. Then there was the address. My great-grandpa had lived in a small, sleepy town that felt like it was stuck in time. But the address in the file wasn't for his old house. It was for a care home, one I'd never heard of. I decided I had to see it for myself. I had to know if this was some sick prank or if something else was going on. The drive there was long and quiet. As I got closer, I noticed how the landscape seemed to change. The trees were twisted, like they'd grown wrong, and the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though the road was empty. When I finally pulled up to the care home, it looked abandoned. The windows were dark, and the paint was peeling off the walls. There was no sign of life. I hesitated before getting out of the car, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I needed answers. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, and a foul stench hit me like a brick wall. It was the smell of rot and decay, a smell that wrapped around me like a shroud. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. Inside, the place was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, papers were scattered everywhere, and the walls were covered in mold. I started searching, looking for any sign of my great-grandpa or whoever might have sent me that file. But the further I went, the worse it got. I found a room at the end of the hall that looked like it had been locked up for years. The door was heavy, and it groaned in protest as I forced it open. Inside, I found a bed with restraints, the leather cracked and worn. There were dark stains on the mattress, and my stomach churned as I realized what they might be. On the walls were photos, dozens of them, all of my great-grandpa. Some were from before he died, family gatherings, holidays, but there were others too. Photos that couldn't exist. Photos of him old and frail, strapped to that very bed. In those photos, his eyes looked different, almost alive, like they were pleading for help. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed out of the room, the realization crashing over me like a wave. I wasn't just sent to kill my great-grandpa. I was sent to finish something that had already started, something monstrous and wrong. The world spun around me as I stumbled back to the car, my mind reeling with questions I didn't want to answer. But I knew there was no going back. This was only the beginning. I spent the entire drive home in a haze, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What the hell was going on? I'd never come across a job like this before. The deep web was full of shady deals and dark secrets, but this was something else entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking beneath the surface, something that tied me to my great-grandpa in ways I didn't understand. Back home, I locked all the doors and windows, drawing the curtains tight. Paranoia clawed at my mind, and I couldn't escape the sensation that I was being watched, even from the shadows of my own home. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the low hum of my computer. I sat down at my desk, determined to dig deeper, to find out who was behind this twisted assignment. I started with the file, poring over every detail again, looking for anything I might have missed. That's when I noticed something strange about the email address of the client. It was a string of random characters that looked like gibberish at first, but as I stared at it, something clicked. It wasn't random, it was a code, a cipher. My hands trembled as I decrypted it, the letters slowly rearranging themselves into a name. Edward Marlowe, my great-grandpa's younger brother, who disappeared without a trace long before I was born. I felt a chill run down my spine. What was he doing, hiring someone to kill his own brother? My fingers flew across the keyboard as I searched for any information on Edward. Most of it was family history, old photos, stories from my mom about how he vanished one night and was never seen again. But there were whispers, too, rumors that he had been involved in dark rituals and forbidden practices, things that were never spoken of outside hushed family gatherings. I found a news article from decades ago, an obscure piece about a series of murders in my great-grandpa's town. The victims were all elderly, their bodies discovered in their homes, eyes open and mouths twisted in silent screams. The article mentioned a suspect, a man seen lurking near the crime scenes, but the investigation went cold when he disappeared. The name of the suspect, Edward Marlowe. I sat back, the pieces slowly falling into place. My great-grandpa had known about his brother's darkness, his thirst for power, and forbidden knowledge, but what I couldn't understand was why. Why would Edward target his own brother after all these years? And why hire someone like me to finish the job? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, something buried in the past that was clawing its way back into the present. As I sat there, trying to piece together the fragments of my family's history, the air in the room seemed to grow colder, as if someone had opened a window to the void. The shadows deepened, and I swore I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Determined to find out more, I called my mom again, pushing the limits of what I could ask without raising suspicion. I pressed her for stories about Edward, about his relationship with my great-grandpa. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but eventually she relented. "I don't know much," she said, her voice hushed. "But I remember Grandma talking about how Albert and Edward were close when they were young. They grew up together, but Edward changed. He got into strange things, disappeared for days, sometimes weeks. When he came back, he was different, colder, distant." She paused, and I could hear the reluctance in her voice. "Grandma said she heard them arguing one night. Albert accused Edward of bringing something dark into our family, a curse or something. After that, Edward vanished. Grandma always said that he was dangerous, that he dabbled in things he shouldn't have." As she spoke, I could hear the echo of those old family tales, stories that were passed down through generations but never taken seriously. But what if there was truth in them? What if Edward really had dabbled in dark magic and had somehow found a way to come back? When I hung up, the room felt even darker, the shadows longer. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. I had to confront this, face whatever it was that Edward had unleashed. The care home had been a dead end, but there had to be something else, some other clue that would lead me to the truth. I decided to go back to the source, to where it all began. My great-grandpa's old house had been sold after his death, but I still remembered the address. The new owners were rumored to have left it abandoned, claiming it was haunted. I never believed those stories before, but now they seemed to hold a different weight. The drive back to that small town was long and filled with a heavy sense of foreboding. As I approached the house, memories flooded back. The smell of freshly baked cookies, the sound of my great-grandpa's laughter, the warmth of family gatherings. But now, the house stood in eerie silence, its windows dark and lifeless. I pushed open the gate, the rusty hinges screeching like a dying animal. The front door was unlocked, hanging ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. The air inside was stale and thick with dust. I wandered through the rooms, each one echoing with memories that seemed to flicker just out of reach. In my great-grandpa's old study, I found something unexpected. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with dusty tomes and family albums. But one book stood out, a leather-bound volume that looked ancient. It was resting on the desk, as if waiting for someone to find it. I picked it up, brushing off the dust to reveal a title etched into the cover: Rituals of the Lost. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with strange symbols and cryptic writings. As I flipped through it, I realized that it was a grimoire, a book of forbidden knowledge, passed down through generations. My heart raced as I read the final entry, written in a familiar hand. It was my great-grandpa's handwriting. He had known about Edward's darkness, about the rituals, and he had written his own warning, a message to whoever found the book. "Beware the shadows that walk between worlds," he had scrawled. The ink faded, but still legible. Edward's curse is not bound by death. He seeks to return, to finish what he started. Do not let him. End it before it begins. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows thickening as if alive. I felt a chill pass through me, a whisper of something ancient and evil. My great-grandpa's warning was clear. Edward was trying to come back, and I was the only one who could stop him. But how do you fight something that's already dead? I sat in that musty study, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. My great-grandpa had been preparing for something like this. A nightmare passed down through our bloodline. The weight of the book in my hands felt heavier, like a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying all my life. Edward was coming back, and I was caught in the middle of a twisted family feud that spanned generations. I knew I couldn't do this alone. The thought of reaching out to someone, anyone, for help crossed my mind. But who would believe me? This wasn't the kind of thing you could just bring up over coffee. The people I worked for on the deep web were out of the question. They were ruthless and cold, the type who wouldn't hesitate to exploit the situation for their own gain. As I sat there, flipping through the brittle pages of the grimoire, I stumbled across something that caught my eye, a section on binding rituals. It was written in my great-grandpa's hand, his words careful and precise. He had found a way to trap Edward, to bind his spirit so that he couldn't cross back into the living world. But the notes were incomplete, the final part torn out, as if someone had tried to destroy the evidence. I needed to find that missing piece. There had to be something in this house, some clue that would lead me to the answers. I searched the study, pulling books from the shelves, scattering papers across the floor, but there was nothing. My frustration mounted, a growing tide of desperation. Then I remembered the attic. It was a place I had always been afraid of as a kid. A dark, cramped space filled with cobwebs and forgotten memories. I hadn't thought about it in years, but if there was anywhere in this house that held secrets, it was there. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed up, the dim light barely piercing the darkness. The air was thick with dust, swirling around me in a haze. I rummaged through boxes, old furniture, and trunks, my fingers brushing against memories I had long buried. Then in a corner, I found a small locked chest, its surface worn with age. It took me a while to find the key, hidden in the lining of an old coat hanging nearby. My hands shook as I unlocked the chest, the lid creaking open to reveal its contents. Inside were letters, photographs, and a leather-bound journal, all tied together with a frayed ribbon. The journal was my great-grandpa's. I opened it. The pages yellowed and fragile, revealing his thoughts and fears. He had written about Edward's descent into madness, about how he had become obsessed with the occult and forbidden rituals. There were entries about their arguments, about how Albert had tried to save his brother from himself, but it was too late. Edward had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. As I read, a cold realization settled over me. My great-grandpa hadn't just been trying to bind Edward. He had succeeded. But Edward's power was stronger than he had anticipated, and the binding was only temporary. The missing piece was the final incantation, a ritual that would seal Edward away forever. My eyes fell on a passage that sent a chill down my spine. Edward seeks to return, to claim what he believes is his. He will stop at nothing, even if it means destroying those he once loved. I fear for our family, for the darkness that follows us like a shadow. If you find this, know that you must finish what I started. Bind him and do not look back. It was clear what I had to do. I had to complete the ritual, to end this once and for all. But I was in way over my head, dealing with forces I barely understood. I needed help, and there was only one person I could think of. Julia was an old friend, someone I had met during my early days on the deep web. She was a hacker like me, but she had a fascination with the occult that bordered on obsession. If anyone could make sense of this, it was her. I called her, my hands trembling as I explained everything. To my surprise, she didn't laugh or hang up. Instead, there was a pause, and then she spoke, her voice serious and calm. You're not crazy, you know. This kind of thing, it happens more than people realize. I've seen stuff that would make your skin crawl. I'll help you, but we have to be careful. This is dangerous territory. We agreed to meet at a diner just outside of town, a neutral place where we could talk without drawing attention. As I drove there, the shadows seemed to stretch and dance around me, like they were alive. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, a constant pressure on the back of my neck. Julia was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth at the back. She looked the same as always, her hair a wild tangle of colors, her eyes sharp and knowing. She listened as I laid everything out, from the job to the care home to the journal. Your great-grandpa was dealing with some serious stuff, she said, flipping through the pages of the grimoire. This isn't just some run-of-the-mill haunting. Edward must have tapped into something dark, something that gave him power beyond death. The fact that he's trying to come back means he's not done with whatever he started. She pulled out her laptop, the screen casting an eerie glow in the dim light. We need to find out what ritual he was trying to complete. There might be a pattern, something that ties all this together. Give me a minute. As she worked, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in days, I wasn't alone. There was someone who understood, who believed me, and it made the weight on my shoulders just a little bit lighter. After what felt like an eternity, Julia looked up, her eyes alight with a mix of fear and excitement. I found something. Edward wasn't just trying to come back. He was trying to open a gateway, to bring something else through, something much worse than him. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about my family. It was about something far bigger, something that could threaten everything. The gravity of it all settled over me like a shroud, and I knew we had to act fast. We need to perform the binding ritual, Julia said, her voice steady. But it won't be easy. We'll need specific items, and there's a risk. If Edward's spirit senses what we're doing, he'll fight back. And if he's as powerful as I think he is, it could get ugly. I nodded, determination hardening in my chest. I had to finish what my great-grandpa started. I owed it to him, to my family, to myself. Edward had to be stopped, no matter the cost. As we sat there, making plans and gathering resources, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were racing against time, against something far darker than we could comprehend. But we had no choice. We had to try to fight back against the darkness that threatened to consume us all. Julia and I spent the next few days preparing for the ritual. We didn't have much time, and every passing hour felt like a countdown to something terrible. The shadows seemed to grow darker and more oppressive, the air heavy with a sense of impending doom. We gathered everything we needed, a mix of rare herbs, candles, and other materials, each with its own specific purpose in the binding ritual. The location of the ritual was crucial. It needed to be somewhere that held significance to Edward, a place where his presence was strongest. That meant returning to the care home, the last place he had been seen, before vanishing into whatever hell he had created for himself. The night before we planned to perform the ritual, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a storm of anxiety and fear, churning with thoughts of what could go wrong. I kept seeing my great-grandpa's face in the shadows, his eyes pleading for me to end this nightmare once and for all. I tried to focus on his words, on the knowledge that he had faced this darkness before and had found a way to bind it, even if only temporarily. I woke up drenched in sweat, a scream caught in my throat from a nightmare that slipped away the moment my eyes opened. Julia was already up, her laptop open as she went over the ritual instructions again, cross-referencing them with every scrap of information we had gathered. "This isn't just about trapping Edward," she said, her voice a low whisper. "We need to cut off whatever power source he's using. If we don't, he could break free again." We left for the care home just as the sun began to set, the sky bleeding into a deep, unsettling twilight. The drive was tense, the silence between us filled with unspoken fears and a grim determination. As we pulled up to the dilapidated building, it loomed over us like a specter, its broken windows dark and empty. The air inside was colder than I remembered, and the smell of decay was stronger, more pronounced. It was as if the building itself was rotting from the inside out, consumed by the malevolent presence that lingered within its walls. We set up in the room where I had found the photographs, and the bed with the restraints. It seemed fitting, somehow, to confront Edward in the place where he had been held, where his darkness had festered and grown. Julia laid out the materials in a circle, carefully placing each item according to the instructions in the grimoire. The atmosphere was tense, a tangible pressure bearing down on us as we worked in silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside felt like a warning, a sign that we were not alone. I lit the candles, their flickering light casting long shadows across the room. The air seemed to ripple around us, charged with an energy that was both ancient and terrifying. We were stepping into dangerous territory, and there was no turning back. Julia began to chant the words of the ritual, her voice steady and clear. The language was unfamiliar, the syllables twisting and curling in the air like smoke. I joined her, my voice faltering at first, but growing stronger as we continued. As we chanted, the shadows around us seemed to deepen, coalescing into a form that hovered just beyond the edge of the circle. I felt a chill pass through me, colder than anything I had ever felt before. It was as if the darkness itself was reaching out, trying to break through the barrier we had created. The room seemed to shift and warp, the walls closing in as a low, menacing growl echoed from the shadows. I felt a presence, malevolent and ancient, its hatred burning like a flame. This was Edward's spirit, twisted and consumed by his own dark desires. Julia's voice grew louder, more insistent, as she recited the final incantation. The air crackled with energy, the candles flaring brightly, their flames dancing wildly. I could feel the weight of Edward's gaze on us, a cold, piercing stare that threatened to unravel our very souls. I focused on my great-grandpa's words, on the strength he had shown in the face of this darkness. I felt his presence beside me, a comforting warmth in the midst of the chilling void. Together, we were stronger than Edward, stronger than the shadows that sought to consume us. As we reached the climax of the ritual, the darkness surged forward, crashing against the barrier like a tidal wave. The force of it was overwhelming, a cacophony of rage and despair that threatened to drown us. But we held firm, our voices rising above the din, the words of the incantation weaving a shield of light around us. The darkness screamed, a sound that cut through the air like a knife, reverberating in my bones. The shadows writhed and twisted, fighting against the binding, but slowly, inexorably, they began to recede, drawn back into the abyss from which they had come. I watched as the darkness peeled away, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but the flickering light of the candles and the sound of our own ragged breathing. The air was still. The oppressive weight of Edward's presence lifted, leaving behind a profound silence. It was over. We had done it. The ritual had worked, the binding complete. Edward's spirit was sealed away, his power broken. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, a release from the fear and tension that had gripped me for so long. But even as we gathered our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Edward had been stopped, but the darkness he had unleashed still lingered, a shadow that stretched beyond the boundaries of our understanding. We had won this battle, but the war against the darkness was far from over. We left the care home, stepping into the cool night air, the sky a blanket of stars above us. There was a sense of calm, a quiet that settled over everything like a balm. But beneath it, I felt an undercurrent of tension, a sense that the darkness hadn't fully released its grip. Julia and I drove back in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The road stretched out ahead of us, the headlights cutting through the darkness, revealing only what lay directly in front of us. The weight of what we had just done hung in the air, a silent testament to the power we had confronted. When we reached my apartment, I finally allowed myself to breathe, the tension easing out of my body. We had succeeded. The binding ritual had worked. Edward was gone, sealed away where he could no longer cause harm. But as we sat there, the shadows outside the window seemed to whisper, a reminder that the past was never truly dead. We debriefed, going over every detail, trying to piece together what it all meant. Julia's face was serious, her eyes reflecting the gravity of what we had faced. "We stopped him," she said, her voice calm but edged with caution. "But we need to be vigilant. There might be others who know about Edward, who might try to free him." I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me like a shroud. This wasn't just about my family anymore. Edward's darkness had touched something far deeper, a web of shadows that stretched beyond anything I had imagined. Julia left, promising to keep in touch, to continue researching, to make sure Edward's binding held. I watched her drive away, the taillights disappearing into the night, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As the days turned into weeks, the events of that night lingered in the back of my mind. I went back to my routine, trying to find a sense of normalcy in the aftermath of what had happened. But it was impossible to forget. The memories etched into my consciousness like scars. I spent my nights poring over the grimoire, learning everything I could about the rituals, about the forces we had confronted. There was a strange comfort in the words, a sense of connection to my great-grandpa and the legacy he had left behind. It was a reminder that I wasn't alone, that I had the strength of my ancestors behind me. But with each passing day, the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, as if they were reaching out from the corners of my vision. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, glimpses of movement that disappeared when I turned to look. It was as if Edward's presence still lingered, a ghost of the past, refusing to let go. One night, as I sat at my desk, the grimoire open in front of me, I heard a sound, a soft, insistent whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the voice of my great-grandpa, carried on the wind, a warning from beyond the grave. "Beware the shadows," he whispered, his voice echoing through the room. "The darkness is never truly gone. It waits, biding its time, seeking a way back." The words sent a shiver down my spine, a reminder that the battle against the darkness was ongoing, that it was never truly over. I knew I had to remain vigilant, to keep fighting against the shadows that sought to reclaim what had been lost. In the weeks that followed, I took steps to protect myself and my family. I set up wards around my home, using the knowledge I had gained from the grimoire to create barriers against the darkness. I reached out to others like Julia, forming a network of those who understood the threat we faced. Together, we worked to uncover the secrets of the past, to ensure that Edward's darkness was sealed away forever. But even as we made progress, I knew there would always be those who sought to exploit the shadows, to harness their power for their own gain. The battle against the darkness was far from over, but I was ready. I had faced my fears, confronted the ghosts of my past, and emerged stronger for it. The shadows might whisper, but they no longer held the power they once did. As I sat there, the grimoire open before me, I knew that my journey was just beginning. There were still secrets to uncover, still battles to fight, but I was no longer afraid. I had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, and I would continue to fight, to protect those I loved from the shadows that sought to consume us all. The night stretched on, the stars a beacon of hope in the darkness, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I was no longer alone. I had my ancestors beside me, their strength guiding me forward as I prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. I made a nasty revenge on ex-girlfriend who cheated on with my best friend. I ordered a clown of the deep web. Alright, so buckle up because this story is about to get real messy. It all started last summer. I was in my last year of college, living in a tiny apartment just off campus. Life was pretty good, or so I thought. I had a girlfriend, Sarah, and we'd been together for about 2 years. I also had a best friend, Tom, who I'd known since high school. We were like brothers, or at least that's what I believed at the time. One evening, I was planning a surprise party for Sarah's birthday. I had everything set up at my place, balloons, cake, and all the cheesy romantic stuff she loved. I texted her to come over around 8 p.m., but then she texted back saying she couldn't make it because she was feeling sick. Disappointed, I decided to call it a night early and go to bed. But then I got a weird feeling in my gut, like something was off. I couldn't shake it. I figured I'd just swing by her place and drop off the cake, maybe cheer her up a bit. When I got there, I noticed Tom's car parked a block away. My heart dropped. I knew I shouldn't jump to conclusions, but something didn't sit right with me. I quietly approached her apartment and peered through the window. What I saw next made my stomach twist. There they were, Sarah and Tom, tangled up on the couch, laughing and way too comfortable with each other. My girlfriend and my best friend. Together, I felt sick to my core. Betrayal washed over me like a tidal wave. I stumbled back to my car and drove around aimlessly for hours, thoughts racing through my head. I couldn't believe it. I trusted these two more than anyone else in the world, and they stabbed me in the back. For the next few days, I was a zombie. I didn't confront them, didn't say a word. I was just numb. But then, as the shock wore off, anger started bubbling up inside me. It wasn't just regular anger. It was pure rage. I wanted them to pay, to feel the pain they had caused me. And that's when I started diving deep into the darkest corners of the internet, looking for anything, something that would make them regret ever crossing me. I stumbled across a website that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. The layout was old and clunky, full of strange symbols and weird offers. It was called the Deep Circus, and it claimed to provide services that were unconventional, to say the least. Most of it seemed like utter BS, but then one listing caught my eye. Clown for hire, specializing in retribution and fear. I laughed it off at first. It seemed too ridiculous. A clown? But as I read through the reviews, each one more disturbing than the last, my curiosity turned into intrigue. These reviews spoke of revenge that left lasting scars, both physical and psychological. Some claimed they were haunted by the experience, unable to forget the fear they felt. It sounded insane, but part of me was drawn to it. I wanted them to feel as helpless and betrayed as I did. In a moment of anger-fueled insanity, I clicked the contact button. The form asked for details, what I wanted, who it was for, how far I was willing to go. I poured out my anger in that form, detailing everything that had happened. I didn't hold back. At the end, there was a slider that said intensity. Without thinking twice, I cranked it up to the max and hit submit. It felt good, at least for a second. Then the reality of what I'd done hit me. But before I could second guess myself, an email popped up in my inbox. It was a confirmation with a date and time. Saturday, 11 p.m. The rest of the week was a blur. I was on edge, jumping at every little sound. I couldn't focus on school, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Part of me wanted to call it off, but the other part, the angry, vengeful part, wanted to see it through. Saturday finally rolled around, and I was a bundle of nerves. At 11 p.m. sharp, I was sitting in my car parked outside Sarah's apartment, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to expect, didn't know what this clown would do, but I was committed now. Then from the shadows, he appeared. At first, he looked like a regular clown. Oversized shoes, colorful clothes, and a painted face. But as he got closer, I realized there was something wrong about him. His face paint was smeared and cracked, and his eyes were cold and empty, like he was wearing a mask. I couldn't see his real face underneath. He stopped in front of my car and just stared at me, his smile stretching unnaturally wide. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't some regular prank. This was something much darker. And in that moment, I realized that I might have unleashed something I couldn't control. I opened the window, just a crack, and handed him an envelope with the address and a note of what I wanted. He took it without a word, then turned and walked towards Sarah's apartment, disappearing into the shadows. I watched him go, a mix of fear and anticipation knotting my stomach. I didn't stay to watch what happened next. I couldn't. The guilt and fear were already gnawing at me. I drove away, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had done. I didn't know if I'd ever forgive myself, but I knew one thing for sure. Things would never be the same again. That night, I barely slept. I kept checking my phone, expecting a call or text from Sarah or Tom, but nothing came. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line, that I'd set something in motion that couldn't be undone. And that's when the nightmare started. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that clown's face. Those empty eyes staring into my soul. That unnatural smile twisting in the darkness. I felt trapped in a never-ending loop of fear and regret, haunted by what I'd unleashed. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would consume everything I thought I knew. I didn't hear from Sarah or Tom for a few days after that night, and I tried to go about my life as if everything was normal, but things were far from normal. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped into my throat. I was half expecting the cops to show up at my door, but it never happened. Then on Wednesday night, I got a call from Sarah's number. My heart stopped. I hesitated for a second before answering. Hello? There was a moment of silence, then a strange, distorted noise, like static mixed with distant laughter. It sent chills down my spine. Sarah? I called out, my voice trembling. More static, followed by a low, guttural voice that barely resembled hers. He's here, it whispered. Then the line went dead. I dropped my phone, my mind reeling. What the hell was going on? I tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic set in. I knew I should go over there, see what was happening, but I was paralyzed by fear. What if that clown was still there? What if I'd unleashed something beyond my control? The following morning, I decided to skip my classes and head to Sarah's apartment. I needed to see for myself what was happening. As I approached her place, I noticed the curtains were drawn tight, and the usual sounds of laughter and music were gone. The place looked eerily quiet. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. A sense of dread washed over me. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway that seemed to stretch into oblivion. Sarah? I called out, my voice echoing back to me. Tom? No response. I stepped inside, the air heavy with an unsettling silence. The place was a mess, furniture overturned, broken glass on the floor, and a strange metallic smell hanging in the air. My heart pounded as I ventured deeper into the apartment. In the living room, I found a note taped to the wall. It was written in a scrawled, childlike handwriting. Ready for the show? My blood ran cold. I ripped the note off the wall and crumpled it in my fist. I didn't know what game this clown was playing, but I was in way over my head. The thought of turning back crossed my mind, but something pushed me forward, deeper into the apartment. As I reached the bedroom, I heard a faint sound, like the squeaking of a balloon. It was coming from behind the closed door. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to push it open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a flickering lamp, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And there, sitting in the middle of the room, was a balloon animal, a twisted, grotesque version of a dog with eyes that seemed to follow me. Next to it was another note. Hope you enjoy the act. See you soon. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about scaring them. It was about me too. This clown wasn't just some hired prankster. It was something darker, something that thrived on fear and chaos, and now it had its sights set on me. I backed out of the room, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there, needed to figure out what the hell was happening. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft giggle behind me, a sound that chilled me to the bone. I spun around, but the room was empty, save for that damn balloon animal staring at me. I bolted out of the apartment, my heart pounding in my ears. As I reached my car, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Across the street, standing in the shadows, was the clown. He was watching me, his head tilted to one side, that same unnerving smile plastered on his face. I jumped into my car and sped away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my own apartment, slamming the door behind me. But even there, I didn't feel safe. I felt watched, hunted. I knew I couldn't go to the cops. What would I say? That I hired a clown from the dark web to scare my cheating ex and best friend, and now it was terrorizing me? They'd lock me up for sure. I was alone in this mess, and I had to find a way out before it was too late. For the next few days, I barely left my apartment. I kept the lights on at all times, jumping at every sound. The nightmares continued, growing more vivid and twisted each night. I'd see that clown in my dreams, lurking in the shadows, his eyes boring into my soul. Then, on the third night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a text from an unknown number. Tick-tock, time's running out. My blood turned to ice. I knew it was him. He was toying with me, dragging this out as long as possible. I had to end this, had to find a way to stop whatever horror I had unleashed. I spent hours researching, diving deeper into forums and websites that most people didn't even know existed. Finally, I found a thread discussing the Deep Circus and the clown for hire. There were rumors of a way to cancel the contract, to call off the clown, but it came with a warning. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be a price to pay. Desperation pushed me forward. I followed the instructions, performing a ritual that felt more like a sick joke than anything else. I was instructed to write down my fear, my deepest regret, and burn it at midnight, while reciting a phrase in a language I didn't understand. I had nothing to lose, so I did it, feeling foolish as I muttered the words into the night. But as the paper turned to ash, I felt a shift in the air, a subtle change that sent shivers down my spine. I hoped it had worked, hoped I'd done enough to break free from this nightmare, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, I received another text, this time with an address. It was a place I didn't recognize, somewhere on the outskirts of the town. The message was simple. Final act. Be there. I didn't know what awaited me, but I had no choice. I had to end this once and for all, to confront whatever nightmare I had set in motion. It was time to face the clown, to face the consequences of my actions, and whatever happened next, I knew it would change everything. I spent the rest of that day trying to build up the courage to go to the address the clown had sent me. My hands were shaking as I printed out the map, the lines on the paper blurring with my fear. The address was in a desolate part of town, the kind of place you only went if you had a death wish. But I had to go. There was no other choice. When the clock struck midnight, I got into my car, the engine rumbling to life in the silence of the night. The streets were eerily quiet, and as I drove, I felt like I was heading into the jaws of some hungry beast. My mind raced with possibilities of what might happen, each scenario more terrifying than the last. The address led me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places you only see in horror movies, all broken windows and rusted metal. The building loomed over me, casting long shadows in the moonlight. I parked a little way off and approached on foot, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I got closer, I noticed a faint light flickering inside, casting eerie shapes on the walls. I hesitated at the door, my heart hammering in my chest, but I knew I had to do this. There was no turning back now. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a vast empty space that echoed with my footsteps. The only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, swinging gently as if it had just been disturbed, and underneath it stood the clown. He was even more terrifying in person. His makeup was smeared and cracked, his smile a twisted parody of joy. But his eyes, those eyes were what really got to me. They were dark and hollow, like twin voids sucking in all the light. He didn't move as I approached, just watched me with that unnerving grin. "So, you came," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to echo around the room. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want? Why are you doing this?" He chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You wanted revenge, didn't you? You wanted them to pay." "I didn't want this," I protested, my voice rising. "Not like this." He tilted his head as if considering my words. "It's too late now. The show must go on." I felt a cold dread settle in the pit of my stomach. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, he gestured to the shadows, where two figures emerged. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized them. Sarah and Tom. They looked disheveled, their faces pale and drawn. But what struck me the most was the fear in their eyes, a reflection of my own terror. "They're here because of you," the clown said, his voice almost mocking. "You wanted them to suffer, didn't you?" I shook my head, words failing me. This was a nightmare, a twisted game that had spiraled out of control. I never imagined it would come to this. The clown stepped closer, his smile widening. "Fear is a powerful thing, you know. It consumes, devours, and it spreads like wildfire." "What do you want from me?" I pleaded, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I want you to see," he said simply, "to understand the true nature of your desires." With that, he snapped his fingers, and the lights flickered violently, before plunging the room into darkness. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the sounds of panicked breathing filled the air. "Look around you," his voice echoed in the void. "This is the world you've created." As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I realized that the room was filled with twisted shadows, reflections of my worst fears and regrets, faces of people I had wronged, moments of guilt and shame, all swirling around me in a vortex of despair. I felt like I was drowning, struggling to breathe in the suffocating darkness. I wanted to scream, to escape this nightmare, but I was rooted to the spot, trapped by my own actions. "You can end this," the clown's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "But first, you must face it." The shadows pressed in closer, their whispers a cacophony of accusations and regrets. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting back the tears. I had to confront this, to own up to what I had done. "I'm sorry," I choked out, my voice cracking. "I'm sorry for everything." The words echoed in the darkness, and slowly, the shadows began to recede. The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence that left me breathless. When I opened my eyes, the lights had returned. The clown was gone, and Sarah and Tom were slumped against the wall, looking as bewildered as I felt. The room was empty, save for the echo of my confession lingering in the air. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing. I couldn't let this consume me any longer. I had to make things right, to mend the broken pieces of my life. As I helped Sarah and Tom to their feet, a sense of determination washed over me. This nightmare wasn't over, but I had taken the first step toward breaking free. And whatever came next, I was ready to face it. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking, casting a golden glow over the abandoned warehouse. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to leave the darkness behind and step into the light. But deep down, I knew the clown's words would haunt me forever, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked within. The drive back to town was quiet. Sarah, Tom, and I didn't say a word. We were all too shaken by what had happened, each lost in our own thoughts. As I navigated the deserted streets, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on me. I had set something in motion that I couldn't take back, but now I had to find a way to make it right. When we reached my apartment, I offered them a place to stay, at least for the night. They accepted without hesitation, too exhausted and traumatized to argue. Inside, we sat in silence, the tension between us almost palpable. I could feel their anger and betrayal, and it cut deeper than any knife. "I'm sorry," I finally said, breaking the silence. "I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted—" My voice trailed off, unable to find the right words. "To scare us," Sarah finished, her voice bitter and laced with hurt. I nodded, shame washing over me. "I thought it would be harmless. I didn't realize." My words felt hollow. Even to me, I had let my anger consume me, and now we were all paying the price. Tom leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. "That clown," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was he?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I found him on the dark web. It was supposed to be a joke, a prank, but he's something else." Sarah shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "He's not human," she said. "The things he showed us, the way he twisted everything, it was like he was feeding off our fear." I nodded, the memory of those hollow eyes still fresh in my mind. "I think he's something supernatural," I said slowly. "Something that thrives on fear and chaos." We sat in silence, the weight of our shared experience pressing down on us. I knew I had to do something to make this right, to end this nightmare once and for all, but I didn't know where to start. "Maybe we can find a way to reverse it," Tom suggested, his voice laced with desperation. "There must be something we can do." I thought back to the forums I had visited, the cryptic messages and warnings. There was talk of a ritual, something that could break the bond with the clown and banish him back to wherever he came from. But it was risky, and there were no guarantees. "We could try a ritual," I said slowly. "There are stories about people who've gotten rid of him, but it's dangerous. If we mess it up—" "We have to try," Sarah interrupted, determination in her eyes. "We can't live like this, constantly looking over our shoulders. We have to stop him." I nodded, feeling a spark of hope amidst the despair. We spent the next few hours scouring the internet, piecing together bits of information about the ritual. It required specific ingredients, things that weren't easy to come by, but we were determined. By the time night fell, we had everything we needed: candles, salt, a mirror, and an old book of incantations that Tom had managed to find at a local thrift shop. We set up in the living room, drawing a circle of salt on the floor and placing the candles at each point. "This is it," I said, taking a deep breath. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Sarah and Tom nodded, their faces pale but resolute. Together we lit the candles and positioned the mirror in the center of the circle. I opened the book and began to read the incantation, my voice trembling but steady. The air grew heavy around us, charged with an unseen energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The candles flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. As I continued to chant, I could feel a presence stirring in the room, something dark and malevolent. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and I saw a flash of movement. The clown's face, twisted in anger, his eyes burning with hatred. I faltered for a moment, fear threatening to overwhelm me, but Sarah squeezed my hand, grounding me. "We can do this," she whispered, her voice fierce. I nodded and continued the incantation, my voice growing stronger with each word. The air crackled with electricity, and the room seemed to tilt, as if reality itself was warping around us. The clown's face grew clearer in the mirror, his expression one of rage and defiance. He reached out, his hand pressing against the glass, and I felt a surge of terror, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. This was our only chance. With a final, desperate shout, I finished the incantation, the words echoing around us like a thunderclap. The candles flared brightly, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was silence, a suffocating, absolute silence. Then the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. A cold wind swept through the room, and I felt a presence leaving, dissipating like smoke in the air. We sat there, breathless and shaking, the enormity of what we had done settling over us. The clown was gone. We had broken the bond, banished him back to whatever hell he had come from. But the fear lingered, a reminder of the darkness we had faced. We knew we could never truly escape what had happened, but at least we had taken back control, reclaimed our lives from the nightmare that had consumed us. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We had survived, and while the scars would remain, we were free. We had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side, forever changed, but stronger for it. And as we sat together in the quiet aftermath, I knew one thing for certain. We would never forget the clown or the lessons we had learned, but we would move forward together, leaving the shadows behind us. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The terror of what had happened still lingered in the back of our minds, but we were determined to move on. We had faced something beyond our understanding, something that had pushed us to the brink, but we had survived. Sarah and Tom stayed with me for a few more days. We spent hours talking, unpacking everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it all. We were bonded by our shared ordeal, and though the wounds would take time to heal, there was a new understanding between us. The clown was gone, but traces of his presence remained, like shadows that danced just out of sight. I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear a distant echo of laughter that sent shivers down my spine. But I had to believe that these were just remnants, the lingering echoes of a nightmare that was finally over. The first time I went back to my classes, I felt like an alien in a world that had moved on without me. Everything felt surreal, the mundane routines clashing with the chaos I'd experienced. But I forced myself to push through, to focus on rebuilding the pieces of my life that the clown had shattered. One evening, as I was packing up my things to leave the library, my phone buzzed with a new message. I froze, dread pooling in my stomach. It was from an unknown number. The circus never ends. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. Maybe it was just a prank, some sick joke from someone who'd heard rumors of what had happened. But as I read and reread the message, a cold realization settled over me. The clown might be gone, but his influence was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I had meddled with forces beyond my comprehension, and there was a price to pay for my actions. When I showed Sarah and Tom the message, they shared my concern. We decided to meet up at my place to discuss what it could mean and what our next steps should be. That night, as we sat around the table, the atmosphere was tense. We couldn't ignore the possibility that the clown, or whatever entity he was, might still have a hold on us. "We have to be careful," Tom said, his voice steady but anxious. "We can't let our guard down, not yet." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We beat him once. If he comes back, we'll do it again. We have to stick together." Her words gave me strength. We had faced the darkness before, and we had come out stronger. If the clown thought he could still haunt us, he was wrong. In the following weeks, we took precautions. We stayed vigilant, checking in with each other regularly, always aware of our surroundings. Slowly, the fear began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet resolve. I learned to live with the shadows, to accept that some things would never be fully understood. The clown had taught me a lesson I would never forget, that darkness exists, but so does the strength to fight it. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, a sudden thought struck me. I opened my laptop and logged into the deep web, back to the website where it all began. It was still there, unchanged, with its eerie offers and promises. I scrolled through the listings, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to shut it down, to erase it from existence, but I knew that wasn't possible. The darkness would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. Instead, I left a review, a warning to anyone who might stumble upon it in a moment of anger or desperation. I told them the truth, that what seemed like a joke or a prank was something far more sinister, that once you invite darkness into your life, it's not so easy to banish it. As I hit submit, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I couldn't change the past, but maybe I could help someone avoid making the same mistake I had. In the end, we were survivors. We had faced a nightmare and come out the other side, forever changed, but still standing. And while the clown's laughter might echo in the corners of my mind, I knew we would face whatever came next together with a newfound strength that could not be broken. And so we moved forward, one day at a time, leaving the circus behind us. We chose to focus on the light, to embrace the life that awaited beyond the shadows. Because in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the fear, but the courage to overcome it. I uncovered deep secrets about my family on the deep web. The next day, I was called on a mission. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to snoop through my family's past, but a few months ago, my curiosity got the better of me. You see, my family was always a bit secretive, especially on my dad's side. My grandparents on that side were practically ghosts in my life. No photos, no stories, just a few offhand comments from my dad about how they weren't around much when he was growing up. It all started when I was bored one night, scrolling through Reddit. I came across a thread about accessing the deep web and all the bizarre stuff people have found there. I'd always been fascinated by the idea of it, the hidden, unindexed part of the internet where you could supposedly find anything. My friend Jake, a total tech nerd, had once shown me how to access it safely. I remembered some of what he'd taught me, enough to feel like I could explore without getting myself into too much trouble. So, with a mix of curiosity and caution, I fired up my laptop, got connected to a VPN, and dove in. Initially, it was mostly what I expected: black markets, strange forums, and some sketchy-looking sites that I quickly clicked away from. But then I found a forum dedicated to genealogical research, which seemed innocent enough at first. The people there were talking about tracing family histories through records that were lost to the surface web, which intrigued me. I thought maybe this was a chance to uncover the mystery surrounding my grandparents. I created an account and started a thread, asking if anyone could help me dig up more about my dad's parents. Within minutes, I got a private message from someone named Archivist. Their message was chillingly simple. I have what you seek. Curiosity and excitement got the better of me. I replied, asking what they meant, and they sent back a link to a private chat room. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. The chat room was empty except for a single message, which read, "Check your email." I did, and sure enough, there was a message from an unknown sender. Attached was a document labeled Family Records. Opening it, I found scanned documents, old photos, and letters. But what really stood out was a series of psychiatric evaluations for a man named William, my grandfather. It detailed a history of violent behavior, institutionalizations, and experimental treatments. The dates matched times when my dad would have been a child, explaining why he never mentioned them. The most disturbing document was a handwritten letter from my grandfather to my dad, dated shortly before I was born. It rambled about cleansing the bloodline and included references to some kind of mission that involved me. My stomach dropped. I felt a wave of nausea and fear. What the hell had I just uncovered? I spent hours going through everything, piecing together that my grandfather had been part of some clandestine group that dabbled in eugenics and had apparently believed my dad was the key to their purification mission. The whole thing sounded insane, like something out of a bad thriller novel. The more I read, the more my skin crawled. There were detailed accounts of my grandfather's meetings with shadowy figures and mentions of experiments on unwitting subjects. There was even a police report from the 1980s about a missing girl in their hometown. My grandfather had been a suspect, but was never charged due to lack of evidence. It was like falling into a pit of secrets that got darker the deeper I went. I didn't sleep that night. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to kick it in. What if the archivist was part of this? What if they were watching me now? The next morning, I felt exhausted but wired, my mind racing with what I'd discovered. I had this gnawing feeling of being watched, and every creak in the house made me jump. I was paranoid, but trying to convince myself that I was just being ridiculous. I needed to know more, to understand what this mission was and why I was involved. I called my dad, trying to act casual, asking if he knew much about his parents' past. He paused for a moment before saying, "We'll talk later." He hung up before I could ask anything else. That afternoon, as I was heading out to meet a friend for coffee, a black SUV pulled up beside me. Two men in suits got out and approached me. My heart started pounding. One of them, a tall guy with sunglasses, said, "You need to come with us." I tried to play dumb, asking them who they were, but they weren't having it. The other man flashed a badge too quickly for me to make out any details. They insisted it was about family matters, and that my dad had requested my presence. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. The men didn't wait for me to decide. One of them grabbed my arm and practically dragged me to the SUV. I knew better than to scream or fight. My neighborhood wasn't the kind where people interfered with each other's business. Once inside the SUV, they didn't speak. I sat there in the back seat, sandwiched between them, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What had I gotten myself into? The car sped off, taking me away from everything familiar and safe. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was heading towards something terrifyingly real and inescapable. That's when I realized my curiosity hadn't just uncovered a family secret, it had awakened a nightmare. The ride in the SUV was silent, the air thick with tension. Every minute felt like an hour as we drove through unfamiliar streets, leaving my neighborhood behind. I tried to keep track of where we were going, but it was pointless. The men had put a black hood over my head the moment we left the neighborhood. All I could do was sit there, heart pounding, mind racing with the possibilities of what awaited me. After what felt like an eternity, the car finally came to a stop. One of the men removed the hood, revealing a nondescript warehouse surrounded by woods. I glanced around, noting that we were far from anywhere familiar, somewhere isolated enough that screaming wouldn't do any good. They ushered me inside, where the air was cold and musty, and the dim lighting made everything look more sinister than it probably was. The inside of the warehouse was filled with rows of filing cabinets and large tables cluttered with documents. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as we walked down a narrow hallway to a small room at the back. A single chair sat in the center of the room under a harsh overhead light. The men gestured for me to sit. Reluctantly, I did. One of them left the room, while the other stood by the door, his expression blank and unreadable behind his sunglasses. A few minutes later, the door opened and a woman walked in. She was older, with graying hair tied in a neat bun, and wore a tailored suit that screamed authority. She sat across from me, folding her hands neatly on the table. "My name is Agent Collins," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I understand you've come across some information about your family that may be concerning." My mouth was dry, and I struggled to find my voice. "What is this about? Why am I here?" She leaned forward slightly. "Your grandfather was involved in some very sensitive projects during his lifetime, projects that remain classified. When you accessed those files, you triggered alerts within our system. We've been monitoring them for years, waiting to see if anyone would attempt to uncover them." "What kind of projects?" I asked, though I already knew the answer wasn't going to be pleasant. "Your grandfather was part of a clandestine government program aimed at developing certain genetic enhancements. His work involved unauthorized experiments, which resulted in several unfortunate incidents." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What does this have to do with me?" Agent Collins sighed, a flicker of something like sympathy crossing her face. "Your grandfather believed your family carried a genetic marker crucial to his research. We've been keeping an eye on your family for generations, ensuring that his work remained buried." The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in, my mind spinning with the implications. "So what? You're going to lock me up to keep it a secret?" She shook her head. "Not exactly. We need your help to ensure this information doesn't get out. The people your grandfather worked with are still very much interested in finishing what he started. Your discovery puts you at risk, and by extension, your entire family." The weight of her words settled heavily on me. I knew I couldn't just walk away from this. "What do you want me to do?" "We need you to retrieve the files and any copies you may have made. Our goal is to eliminate any trace of your grandfather's work from the deep web and your personal devices. As much as I hated the thought of giving into them, I didn't have a choice. The more I learned, the more it felt like a tangled web of secrets that could easily ensnare and destroy me. "Okay," I said, resigned. "I'll help, but you have to promise me my family will be safe." Agent Collins nodded, her expression grave. "We'll do everything we can to ensure that. But you need to understand, the people involved in this won't hesitate to use violence to get what they want." The rest of the day was a blur. The agents took me back to my house, keeping watch while I deleted every file and cleared my browsing history. It felt like an invasion of my personal space, but I knew it was necessary. They left me with strict instructions to act normal, to pretend nothing had happened, and to await further contact. But how was I supposed to go back to normal after everything I had learned? My world had been turned upside down, and paranoia had taken root in my mind. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound, every shadow seemed magnified, feeding into my growing anxiety. I couldn't help but wonder if my grandfather had felt this way too, trapped by his own dark secrets. As I drifted into a restless sleep, I dreamt of cold metal tables, harsh lights, and the faces of people I'd never met. Their expressions were twisted, filled with malice and intent, whispering of things best left forgotten. I woke up the next morning, drenched in sweat, the echo of their whispers still ringing in my ears. I knew I couldn't escape this nightmare, not yet, not until I figured out a way to protect my family from the darkness lurking in our past, and not until I uncovered the true nature of the mission I'd unwittingly been drawn into. I spent the next few days feeling like I was constantly being watched. Every unfamiliar car passing my street, every stranger lingering a bit too long at the corner store, all of it set my nerves on edge. I tried to act normal, like Agent Collins had instructed, but how was I supposed to do that when my family's darkest secrets felt like they were lurking around every corner? I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me, and I jumped at every little noise. At work, I kept checking over my shoulder, convinced that any moment someone would grab me again and take me who knows where. Then, a few nights later, I received another email from Archivist. My heart sank as I opened it, half expecting it to be some sort of threat. Instead, it contained a single sentence: "They're lying to you." Attached was a video file. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. The video was grainy, shot from a hidden camera in what looked like a laboratory. My grandfather was there, looking younger, but still recognizable. He was speaking with a man I had never seen before, their voices low and urgent. They talked about a breakthrough and how the experiment had worked, but at a cost. The camera angle shifted slightly, showing a figure strapped to a table, surrounded by medical equipment. I couldn't make out their face, but the sight of it made my stomach churn. The figure was twitching, jerking violently, as if they were having a seizure. I paused the video, feeling sick. What the hell had I just watched? I had to know more, even if it meant diving deeper into this nightmare. I reached out to Archivist, asking what the video meant. They replied almost immediately, telling me to meet them in person if I wanted the full truth. Against every instinct telling me this was a bad idea, I agreed. They gave me an address in a part of town I rarely visited, notorious for its abandoned buildings and derelict warehouses. I knew it was risky, but I needed answers, and this might be my only chance. The next day, I took a bus to the designated meeting place, a crumbling building covered in graffiti. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay. I hesitated at the entrance, every horror movie instinct screaming for me to turn back, but I forced myself to push on. Inside, the place was a maze of dark corridors and empty rooms. I navigated my way to the back, where a single light bulb flickered above an open doorway. As I stepped through, a figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in a long coat and wearing a mask that obscured their face. "Are you archivist?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They nodded. "I'm sorry for the secrecy. It's necessary for both of our safety." I wanted to demand answers, but I held back, letting them explain. "What you saw in that video was the result of an experiment your grandfather was involved in. The people in charge wanted to create a kind of superhuman, but the side effects were disastrous." "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, the fear creeping back into my voice. "Because the people who took you don't want you to know the truth. They're not protecting you. They're using you, just like they used your grandfather. Their experiments are ongoing, and they need you as a test subject." My head spun with this new information. Could I trust Archivist? Or was this just another layer of manipulation? "Why me?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "What makes me so important?" "Your grandfather's research identified a specific genetic marker, one that only appears in certain individuals. You have it. They believe it's the key to stabilizing their experiments." The weight of their words settled heavily on me. I had been reduced to a lab rat in a secret government project, one that had been running for decades. I didn't know what to believe, but one thing was certain. I needed to protect myself and my family. "What do I do now?" I asked, feeling more lost than ever. Archivist handed me a burner phone. "Stay off the grid as much as possible. Use this to contact me if you need to, but be careful. They'll be watching." With that, Archivist disappeared back into the shadows, leaving me alone in the decaying building, the silence pressing in from all sides. As I made my way back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped deeper into a conspiracy far beyond my comprehension. The government, my grandfather, this genetic marker, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I was never meant to solve. But now that I had started, there was no turning back. Back at home, I stashed the burner phone in a place only I knew about and tried to act normal. The paranoia gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls had eyes, that every step I took was being monitored. I had to get out of this somehow, had to find a way to end this nightmare without getting myself or my family hurt. I was determined to uncover the full truth and expose it, no matter the cost. But as the days went by, I realized the deeper I dug, the more dangerous it became. I was in too deep now, and there was no escape. I spent the next few days living on edge, constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting black SUVs to appear at any moment. The paranoia was eating me alive, making it nearly impossible to focus on anything else. Every night, I'd replay my conversation with Archivist, questioning whether I'd made a mistake trusting them. The burner phone stayed hidden, untouched. I couldn't risk contacting Archivist unless it was absolutely necessary. But the longer I waited, the more desperate I became. I needed to find a way to end this, to get out from under the shadow of my family's dark legacy. That's when I got a call from my dad. He sounded tense, his voice lower than usual, as he asked me to meet him at a bar on the outskirts of town. It was an unusual request. My dad wasn't much of a drinker, and we rarely met outside family gatherings. Something was definitely up. I arrived at the bar early, the place dimly lit and half empty. My dad was already there, seated in a corner booth with a drink in front of him. I could tell from his expression that whatever he wanted to talk about, it wasn't good news. "Thanks for coming," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to dispel a headache. "I've been thinking a lot about what you asked me about my parents. There are things I should have told you a long time ago, but I thought it was better to leave the past buried." I leaned in, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "When I was a kid, your grandfather was always involved in these strange projects. He'd disappear for days, sometimes weeks, and when he came back, he'd be different, more secretive, more intense." He paused, taking a sip of his drink before continuing. "One night, I overheard him talking to someone on the phone. They were discussing experiments using terms I didn't understand at the time, but I remember him saying something about how it was all for the greater good, how our family was destined for this work." My skin prickled at his words. "Did you ever ask him about it?" "Once," he admitted, his eyes darkening with the memory. "He got angry, said I wasn't ready to know the truth. After that, I stopped asking. But now, I wish I had pushed harder. Maybe then I could have stopped this." "What do you mean by this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I think they want you to continue his work, to pick up where he left off. The experiments, the genetic research, it was all leading to something big, and they won't stop until they get what they want." The weight of his words settled heavily on me, confirming everything archivists had told me. But hearing it from my dad, knowing he'd been living with this burden too, made it all the more real. "What do we do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He shook his head, a look of resignation in his eyes. "I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out for years, but they're always one step ahead. You have to be careful. Trust no one, and whatever you do, don't let them get their hands on you." The thought of running, of leaving everything behind crossed my mind, but I knew that wasn't an option. Not yet. I had to find a way to end this, to protect my family from whatever legacy my grandfather had left behind. As we left the bar, my dad placed a hand on my shoulder, in his grip firm. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have told you sooner." "It's not your fault," I replied, though the words felt hollow. "We'll figure this out, together." But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The deeper I dug, the more dangerous this became, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this up without getting caught. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. I had to make a choice, keep running or confront this head on. The decision weighed heavily on me, knowing that one wrong move could mean the end of everything I held dear. In the end, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep living in fear, couldn't keep running from the shadows of my family's past. It was time to confront the darkness and bring everything to light, no matter the cost. With a sense of grim determination, I grabbed the burner phone and dialed Archivist's number, ready to take the next step into the unknown. The line clicked and crackled before I heard Archivist's voice on the other end. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you again." "I need to know everything," I said, my voice firm with resolve. "If I'm going to stop this, I need to know what I'm up against." Archivist paused for a moment before responding. "Meet me tonight at the old industrial park, midnight. Come alone, and don't tell anyone where you're going." The call ended abruptly, leaving me with a sense of impending dread. As the hours ticked by, I tried to calm my racing thoughts, reminding myself that this was the only way to end the nightmare that had taken over my life. At midnight, I made my way to the industrial park, the vast expanse of rusted machinery and crumbling buildings casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my feet as I approached the meeting spot. Archivists emerged from the shadows, their face hidden beneath a hood. "You're brave for coming," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me everything," I insisted, my eyes locked onto theirs. Archivist sighed, gesturing for me to sit on a nearby concrete block. "Your grandfather's work was part of a program designed to create a new breed of humans, enhanced, stronger, immune to disease. But the experiments failed, resulting in horrific mutations. Most subjects didn't survive." I listened intently, the horror of their words sinking in. Why didn't anyone stop them? "There were people who tried," Archivist continued, "but the program was backed by powerful individuals who covered it up, eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. Your grandfather was supposed to find a way to stabilize the process, using a genetic marker found in your family. That's why they want me," I realized, my voice trembling. "They think I'm the key to finishing what he started." Archivist nodded. "Exactly. But they're wrong. Your grandfather's research was fundamentally flawed. He was desperate to prove it would work, even as he watched it destroy lives." A heavy silence fell between us as I absorbed the magnitude of what I had learned. This wasn't just about my family. It was a conspiracy that spanned decades, involving untold numbers of people whose lives had been ruined by these experiments. "I can't let them continue this," I said, determination hardening my voice. "How do we stop them?" Archivist handed me a small USB drive. "This contains all the information you need to expose them. Names, locations, evidence of the experiments. But you'll need to be careful. Once this gets out, they'll come after you with everything they've got." I took the drive, feeling the weight of it in my hand. "Thank you," I said, meeting their gaze, "for everything." "Be safe," Archivist replied. "And remember, trust no one." As I left the industrial park, my mind was set on a single course of action. I couldn't do this alone, but I knew I had to tread carefully. I contacted a trusted friend in journalism, someone who'd proven time and again that they could keep secrets and handle sensitive information. The following days were a blur of clandestine meetings and planning sessions. We worked tirelessly, piecing together the evidence from the USB drive, verifying its authenticity, and preparing to publish a story that would expose everything. On the morning of the release, I felt a mix of fear and relief. Fear of the consequences, but relief that the truth would finally come out. As the article went live, detailing the horrific experiments and the powerful figures behind them, I knew there was no turning back. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets picked up the story. Investigations were launched, and those involved began to scramble, trying to cover their tracks. But it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no burying it now. In the days that followed, I kept a low profile, avoiding unnecessary risks. My family was relocated, given new identities, and placed under protection. I knew it was only a matter of time before those responsible tried to retaliate. But for now, we were safe. I'd like to say that the nightmare ended there, but the reality is more complicated. The scars of what I'd uncovered would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the darkness lurking beneath the surface of the world I thought I knew. But even in the midst of that darkness, there was hope. Hope that the truth would bring about change, that the sacrifices of those who'd suffered would not be in vain. As I watched the world react to the revelations, I felt a sense of closure. I'd done what I set out to do, breaking the cycle of secrets and lies that had haunted my family for generations. And though I'd never truly escaped the shadows of my past, I knew that I'd done my part to make sure they never claimed anyone else.